So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the history of this mechanic here, and that might help kind of motivate why I wanted to do a presentation like this. So back in the oldie days, there was this mechanic called phasing that got introduced in the Mirage block, and I believe it was only the Mirage block that had this. It wasn't like intended to be anything more than just a normal block mechanic back when Magic had blocks. If you notice, there's no reminder text, so if you wanted to know what phasing did, you'd need to take a look at the cute little rules book that they gave you out, and there would be a little entry in there, and it also did not have a whole lot of rules text associated with it. So yeah, that was basically what phasing was for a while. It was pretty simpler time back then. Also, if you notice, this does not say basic land type, so you could shimmer and name Urzas, and then all of their Tron lands would gain phasing, which would make it much more difficult to get the Urzatron assembled. So that's a piece of information you might be interested in if that's a card that you wanted to see. So, okay, after that, someone, and this is probably like the early to mid 2000s, someone came up with the idea at Wizards, hey, you know that card Oubliette from Arabian Nights? Turns out that like this gigantic paragraph of text could get condensed down to just target creature phases out and tap that creature when it phases back in. And that is the phasing mechanic just randomly did exactly what this card that was meant to be like a removal spell. It randomly happened to fit exactly with thematically what the Oubliette card was doing. So as a result, they errated Oubliette to have it was random. Like they weren't planning on that happening. That was just a lucky coincidence. They errated Oubliette so that it actually uses the phasing out to accomplish its goal. And so that means that this is actually the first card that was printed that has phasing. So make sure you word that question very carefully, and you can use that to stump all your Judge trivia buddies, I guess. And then nothing happened again for another really long time, until we got this card, which maybe some of you have seen. If you play Commander, I understand that it's kind of a popular card for some people, and very unpopular card for some other people. But this represents the first new card that was printed with phasing in several years, and that brings us up to today, where basically phasing is an evergreen mechanic now, and it's showing up in pretty much every set. It's not showing up in the old way where a creature would actually have the phasing ability, but it is showing up quite a lot in terms of if you have a creature phasing out, so it's using it as a drawback like the Oubliette did. So that is where we're at now with phasing, and let us now take a look at some stuff about how phasing works. So this is a short, I kind of tried to distill this down because I know we're going to be kind of a short presentation today. This is a short, in a nutshell version of what phasing does. So basically, phasing in and out happens during the untap step. So if something actually did have the phasing ability, that phasing out would happen during the untap step before untapping your permanents. So the phasing in event also happens at that time. Notice this is before you untap your permanents, and notice also that it's in the untap step, so that means if you were to skip the untap step, then no permanents would be phasing in or out that turn. Just like how if you were going to skip your draw step, then you're not drawing any cards that turn. So that's one interesting point to know. Phased in and phased out is a status. So it's basically exactly like if you had a permanent that was tapped or untapped. Tapped and untapped is also a status. So that's basically how phasing is handled as like a technical thing. It's not moving to a different zone anymore, because there actually was a time in Magic's history when that was how phasing worked. But it stays on the battlefield, so it does not count as entering or leaving the battlefield. And so some consequences of that is that tokens can phase in and out, and there's no problem with that. They phase in and out exactly normally. Again, that's a change from how something used to work, so you might encounter some people who remember it working a different way. Phasing does not interact with enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield type of abilities. So anything that looks for it to enter the battlefield or leaves the battlefield is not going to be, interacted with by phasing itself, although there is like kind of an asterisk, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And phasing in and out does not cause the permanent to become a new object. So you know that when something changes zones, it becomes a new object with no memory or connection to its previous identity. Well, guess what? Phasing is not changing zones, and so as a consequence of that, phasing in and out does not cause that to happen. So the other like kind of interesting, wacky-ish thing about phasing is that anything attached to a permanent that phases out is also going to phase out with that permanent. And when it phases back in, it's going to phase back in attached to that permanent. So that is how phasing works as far as when you have equipment or auras attached to something. So if there's any questions about that, definitely throw them in the chat. Like I said, will be monitoring the Discord chat as I go along. But if not, we'll go ahead to the next screen here, where we've got some example questions. And I like to start things out with maybe a little bit straightforward. So the idea would be like Amy is going to threaten Nick's grizzly bears, right? And then play a slip out the back targeting the grizzly bears. So under whose control will the grizzly bears be when it phases back in, and which player's turn will the grizzly bears phase back in? So that is a couple of questions that it might be important for you to know the answer to now that we have phasing cards getting printed in every set. So let's this is kind of one of those like trick sort of things. Like there's no real way you could answer this question correctly if you didn't like know the rule and the comprehensive rules that talks about this situation. So if you take a look, this is the rule that describes what the phasing event looks like. So first, all the phased in permanents with phasing are going to phase out, and then all of the phased out permanents that the active player controlled when they phased out are going to phase in. So that means that if Amy threatens Nick's grizzly bears and then plays a slip out the back on it, Amy is the person who controlled that grizzly bears when it phased out. And so that means that when the grizzly bears phases back in, that is going to be tied to Amy's untap step, because Amy is the person who controlled the grizzly bears when it phased out. So that is the answer to that question. If you were to steal the grizzly bears and then phase it out, then that is your untap step that the grizzly bears is going to phase back in for. Now, unfortunately, this does not mean that you get to steal the grizzly bears forever. We'll see that rule a little bit later on in the presentation. But the expiration of the until end of turn effect that grants you control of the thing with threaten, when that turn ends, then there's not going to be a continuous effect in the game anymore that says Amy should control this permanent. And so when it phases back in, it is going to phase back in with Nick being the controller of that permanent. So that is how the grizzly bears getting threatened would interact with that creature getting phased out. So next up, we've got another... I just had to take a break here for this spice one here. So this is kind of like a building on that example that we saw before, right? So we had the grizzly bears getting threatened before. Now we're gonna have the Vidalcan shackles. It's gonna steal the grizzly bears with the Vidalcan shackles. And so the question is, we're gonna play a reality ripple, and what happens? So with this, I really like this card. Like it's basically like they printed this card, reality ripple, just for this question, which I was really appreciative of when I saw this card. But the question is, what are we going to target with the reality ripple? Because it turns out that there's actually several different things that we could target with reality ripple, and have the answer be different each time. So we're going to start out with maybe the most obvious one, which would be if we were to reality ripple the Vidalcan shackles itself. Okay, so if we were to do that, what would happen? So for that, we're going to need this rule here, which says that continuous effects that affect a phased out permanent may expire while the permanent is phased out. So that's what we were talking about before with the threaten, right? There's a continuous effect that affected the grizzly bears that came from the threaten, and that continuous effect lasts until end of turn. So that continuous effect expires at the end of the turn, and so therefore that continuous effect, they will no longer affect that permanent once it's phased in. So that when the grizzly bears phases back in, the grizzly bears is not going to be affected by the threaten's continuous effect anymore. So interestingly enough, we could also say that the Vidalcan Shackles control changing effect would be a continuous effect that affects a phased out permanent in the case that we just talked about, right? Because the game is tracking whether the Vidalcan Shackles is tapped or untapped, and that's how it knows how long that continuous effect should last for. So we could say that in that sense, yes, this continuous effect from Vidalcan Shackles does affect Vidalcan Shackles. So the permanent has been phased out, though, which means that the game does not know that the Vidalcan Shackles exists anymore, right? So that means that effects with for as long as durations that track that permanent, which is what this is, right? Because it does have a, if you look at the card, it says for as long as Vidalcan Shackles remains tapped, it's going to end when that permanent phases out because the game can no longer see it. So what's going to happen is the Vidalcan Shackles makes a continuous effect in the game, and it says, as long as I am tapped, then we're going to have a control changing effect on this Grizzly Bears. But then the game is going to phase that Vidalcan Shackles out, and at that point, the game does not know whether Vidalcan Shackles is tapped or untapped, because the game doesn't see Vidalcan Shackles anymore. It doesn't exist. And so because it does not exist, the game cannot know whether it's tapped or untapped, and so therefore you would be able to immediately get the Grizzly Bears back to its original controller, because as soon as the Vidalcan Shackles has phased out, the game cannot see that it is tapped anymore, and so therefore it will come back, that will cause the continuous effect that's affecting it to end. And so that's kind of interesting. The Grizzly Bears, of course, or the Vidalcan Shackles, of course, is still tapped, because when you phase it out, it doesn't tap or untap. That stuff still happens during the untap step the way it normally would. But because we cannot see that it is tapped anymore, it's not going to be. So the next question on everybody's mind is, okay, so that would be what would work if we reality rippled a artifact, right? But what if we what if we reality ripple a creature? So now we're gonna have the exact same question. We're steal the Grizzly Bears with the Vidalcan Shackles, but we're gonna phase out the Grizzly Bears now using the reality ripple again. So what will happen in this case? And this is where I kind of don't like the way that this wording, this rule is worded, because it does make things a little bit more confusing, I think. So, especially like the way this is worded, right? Like continuous effects that affect a phased out permanent can expire while that permanent is phased out. So you would think, okay, we're talking about like, you know, the Grizzly Bears is phased out, so maybe the continuous effect can expire. So this just says that it can expire when the Grizzly Bears phases out, not that it is going to expire. If so, they'll no longer affect that permanent. So again, like this is talking about if the control changing effect on Grizzly Bears does expire. So, and then on top of that, we say that in particular, effects with for as long as durations that track that permanent end when the permanent phases out. So now everybody's thinking, okay, so when we phase the Grizzly Bears out, we're tracking that Grizzly Bears with the control changing effect, and so therefore the Grizzly Bears isn't going to have a control changing effect on it anymore. And in fact, that's very misleading. And in fact, the thing I just said is wrong. So the thing that's wrong about it is the duration that tracks the permanent, right? So we are not dealing with, in this situation where we phase out the Grizzly Bears, we are not dealing with an effect with a for as long as duration that tracks Grizzly Bears, right? The thing that we're tracking is Vidalcan Shackles. We are not tracking anything about the Grizzly Bears other than like it's the thing that this continuous effect applies to. So the duration is not tracking Grizzly Bears. It still tracks Vidalcan Shackles. So that means that this is not a case where this rule would apply. Rather, we have a continuous effect that acts on the Grizzly Bears, and it is tracking Vidalcan Shackles. And because we phased out the Grizzly Bears, that does not mean that the Vidalcan Shackles is now untapped, right? The Vidalcan Shackles is probably still tapped. And the continuous effect that applies to Grizzly Bears is going to continue applying to Grizzly Bears as long as Vidalcan Shackles is tapped. And so that means that if the Grizzly Bears phases back in, then there still is going to be a continuous effect applying to it. Because remember, phasing out and phasing in does not count as leaving the battlefield. So the Grizzly Bears that phases back in is still the exact same object. So the game still knows any continuous effects that might be something that applied to the old Grizzly Bears, it still is going to apply to the new Grizzly Bears. And so that means that the control changing effect from Vidalcan Shackles is still going to apply to the Grizzly Bears even after it phases out and phases back in again. And yeah, I know that's really weird and non-intuitive, and that's exactly what I was talking about with the wording on this rule, that I don't think that it does a great job communicating what the answer is in that instance where we're phasing out the Grizzly Bears. It's certainly not as clear as with some of the other ones that whether it would or would not apply. And then of course there's one third thing that we wanted to talk about, which would be if we phased out a land. So of course, like maybe the Vidalcan Shackles player has 2 islands, right? And then we're going to phase out one of the islands. So the Grizzly Bears is still in play, the Vidalcan Shackles is still in play, but one of the islands is going to not exist anymore. And so what do you think would happen in that case? Well, that's a great question. So first thing we might want to look at this is this rule 611.2b. I'm going to spoil a little bit right now. That's not super relevant to this discussion. It just basically talks about how that affects like the Vidalcan Shackles functions in the rules. So this is what that one actually says. So what's going to happen if we phase out the island is going to be once this continuous effect starts, it started, right? The only time we care about how much the power of the creature is and how many islands there is going to be like at one specific time, which is when we see target creature with power less than or equal to the number of islands you control. So that is a requirement on what the target of Vidalcan Shackles is. And as long as that target is a legal target at 2 specific times, which is when we're activating this ability and when it resolves, then that would mean that we don't care about the power of the Grizzly Bears or the number of islands we control at any other time. And so, assuming that the Vidalcan Shackles player has already had that ability resolve, then the Grizzly Bears is going to stay being under their control regardless of how many islands the player continues to control, or regardless of what the Grizzly Bear's power is. And on top of that, what you would want to do then is you would want to reality ripple the island in response to the activation for Vidalcan Shackles. Because if you were to do that, and that brought the number of islands down too low, then that would mean that you would not have a legal target when you had that ability try to resolve, and then nothing would happen. So that would be the way you would need to use the reality ripple in that case if you were going to target the island. So, okay, that's a great example. I love that example. So if anybody had any questions about that, you can throw them in the chat. But hopefully that's good for everybody. Now we're on to this. Oh my gosh. I can't imagine how many great questions I could throw into this presentation. This is amazing. So, okay, we've got Spectral Adversary and we've got Moonrage Brute. And so this has that sweet mechanic. It's called Nightbound and Daybound. And so what that does is if it's nighttime or daytime, then it like makes the permanent transform, right? So, and the idea would of course be like we have the Spectral Adversary and we're going to phase out the Moonrage Brute with it. And then afterwards we're going to like play another spell, right? So that would change night into day, right? Because the active player played 2 spells on that turn. So that is what the situation is. So what is going to happen next turn when the Moonrage Brute player goes to the untap step? And so for that, we're going to need this here. So this is, again, like a little bit of in-depth detail about how the untap step works. So step 1, the first thing that happens in the untap step is we're going to have all the phased-in permanents phasing out, and all the phased-out permanents, which the Moonrage Brute is, phase back in, right? So that happens. That is the first thing that happens in the untap step. Now notice the second thing that happens is we check to see if it should change from day to night. So what's going to happen is we're going to have the Moonrage Brute phase in, and then afterwards, because the player played 2 spells, then it's going to change from night into day. And so it's going to transform back into Brutal Cathar. Now remember, because of the way Daybound and Nightbound work, that's not like a thing that goes on the stack or a triggered ability or something. It just happens like as soon as the day changes into night, or the night changes into day, the transformation is going to happen. And so again, remember, the untapping part in the untap step hasn't even happened yet, right? Like the first thing that happens is phasing, and then the second thing that happens is day-night, and then the third thing that happens is untapping. So if this Brutal Cathar was tapped when it phased out, then it's not going to get untapped until like after both of those things have happened. And so then we've got something kind of cool, right? Because we transformed into Brutal Cathar, so we get this triggered ability where we exile a creature that an opponent controls, right? And so that is, like we said in the chat, not going to happen during the untap step at all. Even though the thing that caused that ability to trigger happens in the untap step, no one gets priority during the untap step. And so that would mean that this triggered ability is going to go on the stack during the upkeep. And that is the point at which Brutal Cathar player is going to have to say what creature that they're going to target with this ability. So that's kind of cool. I really liked this question, and I like presenting it to judge candidates because it's a great question to help make sure that they understand exactly like what the steps for the untap step is. Maybe not for like level 1 exam prep, but maybe I think this actually could potentially be a level 1 exam question, but certainly a lot of concepts in there that would be helpful to know for someone who is preparing for a level 1 exam. And with only 2 cards too, that's something that I like, and they're obviously both in the same standard set, so this probably happened in a limited game at some point in time. That's this question here. Looks like looking at the clock here, we probably got time for about one more example. And this is something that I guess is also going to involve 2 cards from the same standard set. So I wanted to make sure we talked about that one. So here we go. We got the Girder Groons, and we're going to blitz them in, right? So that's the idea. We're blitzing in the Girder Groons, and then after we deal damage, after we attack and we deal the damage, we're going to slip out the back. So what happens? And if you watch Judging for the Win, then hopefully you remember what happens because this was a recent episode that I did. But if not, this is a good one. So there's 2 specific things that I want to talk about with this interaction, right? And that would be like, how does this work with the when this creature dies, draw a card ability that Blitz gives you? And how does this work with the sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step ability that it gives you? So there's actually 2 different things that we're going to need to know how they work. And so we're going to, again, do my favorite thing in the world, which is open up the CR, crack it open, and have a lookerino. So this is what Blitz means in the comprehensive rules right now. So there's some specific stuff that's going to be relevant to us, which is, if this spell's Blitz cost was paid, sacrifice the permanent this spell becomes at the beginning of the next end step. So there's 2 very important things that I want to draw everybody's attention to with this sentence here. Number 1 is that if you have a card that you cast using Blitz, the thing that makes you sacrifice is not an ability that is baked into Blitz, right? So even if you lose all your abilities, once it's on the battlefield, if you cast it using Blitz, the thing that sets up the sacrifice me at end step is already set up. That's one of the effects of a resolving Blitz spell, is setting up the ability that makes you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So that means that even if that permanent doesn't have any abilities at all, or even if it's not on the battlefield anymore, then this triggered ability is still going to be around, and it's still going to trigger. So even though the blitzed creature has phased out, and therefore it doesn't exist, and therefore none of its triggered abilities are going to trigger, even with that being the case, we still are going to have this ability trigger at the beginning of the next end step. So if you notice something really cool, the second thing that I wanted to point out with this is that we're triggering at the beginning of the next end step. And what that means is that there is one specific time when this triggered ability is going to trigger. And so once this ability triggers and resolves, it's done. It's not triggering at the beginning of any other end steps. It already triggered during the one specific end step that it got called out for. And so that means that once that happens, then we are off the hook forever. And we are never going to have to sacrifice that blitz creature at end of turn. Because once we had the one end step that we were in danger of sacrificing it, and we're past that point, the game is not going to make you sacrifice it anymore. So you don't have to sacrifice it. That's interesting idea number 1. Interesting idea number 2 is, as long as this permanent's blitz... So this says, as long as this permanent's blitz cost was paid, it has haste, and when it's put into a graveyard, draw a card. So notice that this applies while a permanent is on the battlefield, and it has the blitz ability. Okay, so guess what? It's exactly like what we were saying before. The blitz permanent does not become a new object with a new identity when it phases out and phases back in. The game still knows it's the same permanent. And so guess what? The game still knows that we did pay its blitz cost. And hey, that means that it's a permanent, it's on the battlefield, it has Blitz, and we paid its Blitz cost. Guess what? It still has haste, and it still has when this permanent is put into a graveyard, draw a card. And obviously the gaining haste part is not super relevant because it doesn't need haste to attack when it has phased in. You only need haste during one turn of your existence. But the being put into a graveyard, draw a card definitely does have relevance, which means that anytime this Girder Goons dies, it is going to cause you to draw a card. Whether it's the turn it phased out, the turn it phases in, 10 turns down the road, it'd be tough to like kill it during the turn it phased out, I suppose. But any time after it phases back in, it will still get to draw a card. So that is very cool. And with that is all of the questions that I had prepared for today and all the material. Thank you so much for showing up. I will be monitoring the chat for a little while to answer any other questions that people might have for the remaining allotted time of my presentation. But that is the end of the material that I had prepared for today.